Ladies and gentlemen in attendance and boxing fans joining us around the world, live from Atlanta, Georgia, it's showtime! Introducing to you first the challenger on my right, fighting out of the blue corner tonight, seeking his third division world title. Wearing white trunks with yellow and silver trim, the young star of boxing from Baltimore, and representing his adopted home of Atlanta, Georgia. He weighed in at 139 3/4 pounds with a sensational record of 24 wins, no losses. He has 23 big wins coming by way of knockout. Here is the popular and acclaimed three-time two-division world champion, the hard-hitting, current and undefeated WBA super featherweight and WBA lightweight champion of the world, introducing Gervonta Davis.
On Netflix, to those of you joining us right here in Texas, are you ready to make history? Let's meet the fighters. First, fighting out of the blue corner, silver and chrome trunks. He stands 6 feet 1 inch tall. He weighed in at 227.2 pounds. He holds a near perfect professional record of 10 victories, 1 defeat, with 7 of those wins coming by way of knockout. And he fights out of Dorado, Puerto Rico, by way of Cleveland, Ohio, USA. He is the multi-talented superstar who bridged the gap between social media and professional boxing. Boxer, a content creator, an entrepreneur, a philanthropist, and a promoter, and the self-proclaimed of boxing. Ladies and gentlemen, he is the problem child, Jake El Gallo Paul!
Jake Paul versus Gervonta Davis fight in 2025 was pure chaos in the ring. The undefeated knockout king went toe-to-toe with a YouTube villain, and what unfolded was brutal, shocking, and unforgettable. Did Jake Paul just conquer the impossible, or did Tank Davis expose him in the most violent way possible? Jake Paul versus Gervonta Davis. On paper, it looked like the kind of fight that should never have been allowed. A cruiserweight who walks around at over 200 pounds stepping into the ring against a lightweight champion who built his legacy at 135. The size difference alone made regulators in Atlanta slam the brakes on the original fight deal. They weren't willing to take the risk, but boxing has never been a sport that runs on logic. It runs on spectacle. And that's why the fight was moved to Miami's Casa Center, a city that thrives on chaos and entertainment. What we got wasn't just a boxing match. It was the biggest mismatch in recent history turned into a global event. Netflix saw the opportunity, jumped in, and packaged the fight like the Super Bowl of combat sports. And it worked. Millions around the world tuned in, not just to see punches thrown, but to witness what happens when a YouTuber turned bruiser collides with one of boxing's most feared knockout artists. It wasn't about belts. It wasn't about rankings. It was about history. Now, the weight gap wasn't just a storyline. It was a storm. Jake Paul, the problem child, carried a frame that dwarfed Tank Davis. Taller, heavier, longer reach. On paper, it was David versus Goliath. But here's the twist. In this story, Goliath wasn't the natural-born fighter. Jake Paul was the outsider, the disruptor, the wild card who built his reputation, knocking out names the boxing establishment never respected. Gervonta Davis, he was the David with dynamite in his fists. 24 wins, 23 by knockout, undefeated, and feared across 3 divisions. The clash was less about fair play and more about what happens when hype meets pure skill. But this fight didn't come out of nowhere. The seeds were planted years ago, and the trash talk was gasoline on the fire. Rewind 4 years back when Jake Paul called out Canelo Alvarez in a move most people laughed at. That's when Gervonta Davis jumped in and famously said he'd beat the brakes off Jake Paul. It was a quick jab on social media, but Jake being Jake, he didn't let it slide. He mocked Davis's height, turned him into a punchline, and used his massive online following to flip the insult into promotion. From there, it snowballed. Tank brushed Paul off as not a real boxer. The same line critics had used since day one, but Paul leaned into it. Every insult, every dismissal, he turned into fuel. The more the boxing world told him no, the louder his fans shouted yes. And the louder his fans shouted, the more pressure built on fighters like Davis to actually step in the ring and silence him. The rivalry hit another level after Jake Paul shocked the world by beating Mike Tyson. What made it fascinating was how different the two men were. Jake Paul, brash, loud, always selling a fight like it's a Hollywood blockbuster. Tank Davis, quiet but cold, letting his fists do the talking. When Tank said he'd put Paul to sleep, it wasn't a joke. It was a promise backed up by a record of turning lights out almost every time he stepped into the ring. That's why the fight became inevitable. It wasn't just two boxers squaring off. It was two worlds colliding. Jake Paul, the most watched disruptor in boxing, testing himself against a pound-for-pound star who had nothing to prove, but everything to lose if he let the YouTuber get the better of him. The weight gap, the trash talk, the Tyson fight, all of it created a pressure cooker. By the time fight night came around, the world wasn't just watching. The world was holding its breath. And that's how a fight that never should have happened did. Jake Paul's rise in boxing has been nothing short of outrageous. We're talking about a guy who started out as a prankster on YouTube, making wild videos for clicks, and then somehow ended up in the ring with one of the most terrifying names in combat sports history, Mike Tyson. And not just ending up there, actually winning. Now, was Tyson 58 years old at the time? Yes. Did he look like the same Iron Mike who used to send heavyweights into early retirement? Absolutely not. But still, beating Tyson, even a late career version of him, gave Jake Paul the golden ticket. He turned what should have been a gimmick into what he called the defining win of my career. Critics, of course, weren't buying it. They called the Tyson fight a robbery. They said Tyson looked tired, old, and should never have been in the ring with a 20-something powerhouse like Jake. Eddie Hearn flat out called the whole event an insult. But here's the thing. Whether you loved it or hated it, people couldn't stop talking about it. And Jake Paul, he knew exactly how to spin it. To him, that win wasn't about Tyson's age. It was about beating a legend, stealing headlines, and rewriting his place in boxing history. And the reaction was chaos. Colby Covington came out swinging with words, saying Jake looked soft and not a real boxer. Clarissa Shields, one of the most decorated fighters alive, mocked Jake's entire approach, calling it nothing but chaos and hustle. Francis Ngannou, the heavyweight monster from MMA, joked about slapping Jake around just to humble him. And Andre Ward, a retired great, basically told Jake, fight a real contender if you want to prove yourself. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a hot take. But here's where Jake flipped the script. Instead of getting crushed by criticism, he used it like rocket fuel. Every fighter's insult turned into a headline. Every tweet became a soundbite for his next promo. And suddenly, Jake Paul wasn't just a YouTuber clowning around in boxing. He was a name that real champions were forced to acknowledge. Love him or hate him, the man created conversations the sport hadn't seen in years. Now built on grit. Born in Baltimore, raised in a tough environment, boxing wasn't just a sport. It was serve. That's why heading into this fight, most of the boxing world believed Jake Paul was finally walking into a trap he couldn't escape. Sure, Jake had beaten names like Woodley, Anderson Silva, Nate Diaz, and yes, even Tyson. Paul, the loud disruptor with millions of followers, selling fights like a Hollywood blockbuster. Nobody cared about whether Jake was legit or not.